Latinx Can, a podcast showcasing Latinx professionals who turn their dreams into realities. I'm your host, la doctora Jeniree Flores Delgado, and today you will hear about my own story, my ups and downs, and the motivation that led me to start this podcast. And I'm here to tell you, sí se puede, my friends, sí se puede. Hi, everybody. I'm here recording my own episode. As I promised, the final episode is about my story and the story of the podcast. And I was putting this off because I didn't have a person that could record the episode with me. I was trying to figure it out. And eventually, I thought that maybe I can record my own episode. After all, I do speak to myself a lot, and I'm often alone when I do that, so I might as well just hit record. So, like you have heard probably in the podcast, I was born in Venezuela in a city called San Cristobal, which is right on the border with Colombia. And I grew up there. My mom and my dad were professionals. My mom was an engineer, or still is an engineer, and my dad, a university professor. And I grew up in a household with an older sister who eventually also became an engineer, and a younger brother. And when I was there, my mom's side of the family was very into sports. My mom played basketball when she was little. My dad played a lot of sports. And even to this age, he's 75, I think, or 77. He still plays tennis, and he wins every time I play against him. So my parents both did a lot of sports, and I think I probably was one of those kids whom their mothers didn't know what to do with them because they had too much energy. I think that was true for my mom, and my mom decided to actually enroll me in a gymnastics class. So when I was about 5, they enrolled me into this class, and I started gymnastics, and I loved it. I loved it because I was that kid that I was always doing handstands against the wall. The walls in the house for my mom were always dirty because I just couldn't keep quiet. So when they took me into this gymnastics class, I fell in love with it, and I did gymnastics for I think it was about 10 years. And during those 10 years, I did gymnastics competitively. I was national champion for Venezuela in my category or in my age bracket a couple of times. And I actually made it to the national gymnastics team, the one that would try out to go to the Olympics. So when I made it to the national team, I didn't quite like it. It required a lot of things from me, more than just training. They took us to the capital in Caracas, and we were in this sort of I don't know how you call it in English, but essentially what we did is it was like a camp that was forever, and we would live there, and we would practice gymnastics in the morning and in the afternoon. And for a couple of hours in the day, we would also go to school. But our main responsibility was to practice gymnastics, to train every day, and then, of course, go to competitions when we had to go to competitions. And I didn't like it. I was far away from my mom and my dad and my brother, who was maybe 3 or 4 at the time, and my sister as well, and all of my friends. And so I tried a couple of weeks to get adapted to that situation, and I didn't like it. So I quit. I quit the national team, And then I went back to San Cristobal, to my hometown, and I continued to practice gymnastics and to go to school like I had been doing so far up until that point. And I think one of the reasons why I didn't like it at the national team was because there was no emphasis on education. The emphasis and the focus was truly to be a gymnast, but not to be a person who has a good education. And so for me, I was always very studious as well. I always got really good grades at school. And for me, that was important. And I actually remember I must have been maybe 10 or 12 years old, and the local channel for my state was doing a piece on me, and they came to my house with their cameras and they recorded extracts of me doing chores or pretending to study, and then they went to the gym and they also filmed me when I was training with my coach. And in one of those, during the preparation of that episode that they were going to air, they interviewed me. And the host of the show asked me, "Well, Jeniree, what do you think you're going to be, or what are you going to do when you grow older?" And my answer was a very honest answer, and I told him, "Well, I plan to study because nobody can live out of sports in this country." And my mom looked at me and her face was blank because, of course, she didn't expect that answer. And of course, that answer didn't go on air. But it's just an example of really what I was thinking. Even at the time, I thought my education was the most important thing. And even though I love gymnastics, that was definitely the second priority in my life. And so I think that really comes from what my parents taught me growing up, though. My mom always taught me that education came first, and my dad as well. And I was very lucky, my sister and I, and even my brother, to go to private school in Venezuela. And really, we were very privileged to have had that kind of education because it was better than the public education that any other person is entitled to in Venezuela. So we were very privileged, and that's how I grew up, basically. But throughout my entire time, up until the age of probably 17 or 18, I had a very rigorous schedule. Because sports was so important to me, and I was very, very competitive. I was a very high level in gymnastics. My routine every day would consist of going to school from 7 a.m. in the morning until 1 p.m. in the afternoon. And then I would go home and have lunch and do a little bit of homework. And at about 3 or 3:30 p.m., I would go to either my gymnastics practice until I was 15 years old. And after that, I practiced diving, and then I would go to diving instead of gymnastics. But anyway, practice was always in the afternoon. And so I would have to go to practice, say, at 3 or 4 p.m. And then I would practice for about 5 hours. And that would take me to probably about 7 or 8 p.m. And then after that, I would go home, I would eat dinner, and I would study some more and then go to bed by 10 p.m. So for something like 12 years of my life, that was my routine. And I was a very, very disciplined person. And I loved the sports that I did. So I always worked really, really hard. So I got from the sports that I practiced and from the competitions that I went to, I really got the sense of responsibility. And I got to understand that if I had a goal, the only way that I was going to achieve that goal was by working hard and by putting all my effort and my passion towards that goal. And so, like I said, I did gymnastics until I was 15, and then I bargained with my mom to let me quit the sport because, I had already made it to the national team. The next step after that was to trying to go to the Olympics one day. And I decided not to pursue that road. And so there wasn't a lot more that I could do by continuing to practice gymnastics. So then once my mom let me quit gymnastics, I found myself in this limbo where I had too much time and I didn't know what to do with it. And somebody had told me about diving. And so I joined the diving team when I was 15, maybe close to 16 years old. And it was like starting all over again. For the diving team, for those of you who have seen diving and gymnastics on TV, they're very similar in which you do all these somersaults in the air. But they're also very different in which you land on your feet when you do gymnastics and on your head when you do diving. And so for me, really, that was the hardest part, was learning how to land on my head and not on my feet. And even though I had everything else covered, I knew how to jump, I knew how to do somersaults. I really had to work very hard to learn how to dive properly. But I didn't. It was another sport that after a couple of months I fell in love with, and I also did really well. I liked it, and like I said before, I worked really hard. I set a goal for myself, and I met my goal the only way that I knew how to do it, by working hard and being very disciplined. So a couple of years into diving, I started doing competitions again at the national level. And I started gaining some recognition for the dives that I was doing. And I also got into a selected group of divers that were considered to have quite a bit of potential, and they could eventually make the diving team, the national diving team, to start competing to eventually go to the Olympic Games. And so I made that team. I think I was 16 or 17, like I said, and I loved it. I loved diving. I think it also was a really good way to fill the void that gymnastics left in my life. And at the same time, I was good at it. So I felt like if I put a little bit of effort, I could really develop into somebody who was good at the sport. And so I did that. I became a well-recognized diver. I was selected for a couple of training camps in the place where the national team would meet, and I trained with the best coaches in the country at the moment. Well, except for my coach, because he wasn't there, but he was also one of the best coaches as well. One of the things that was different in doing gymnastics and diving when I was in Venezuela versus what I have learned, or how the sports world works in the United States, is that even though my family had a little bit of money, we were probably before Chavez, we were middle class, maybe middle to upper class. And yes, my parents had enough money to pay for private education, but they didn't have the kind of money that people invest in the United States when they want their children to practice a sport. My sporting experience and my sporting life was basically sponsored by the government in my state. They would select a group of trainers and they would pay them, and then these trainers would train the teams for the state, or even different athletic clubs would have their own trainers, but the state would pay them to be coaches. And then as an athlete, we would also get a little bit of monetary support from the state because we invested so much time playing a sport or doing a sport that we couldn't work. So they would pay us like a scholarship for doing sports on a daily basis. And then for the trips that we did, there was definitely a time when my parents, and especially my mom, had to pay for the trips that I took to go to competitions or maybe to go to a training camp at another state. But I would say that for the majority of my gymnastics career, my travels and my uniforms and any equipment I needed was actually covered by the state. And so that was a huge difference in terms of how I see sports being in Venezuela versus in the United States, because it was very accessible. Even though my family had a little bit of means to pay for even a gymnastics career if I needed it, the majority of my teammates were not people who had the same financial ability as my family. They were actually from very humble beginnings. And so I did that. Like I said, I did gymnastics and diving, and that's all I knew. And I did that while I was going to school. So it was probably, I was 17, and I had this goal in my mind in which I wanted to study in the United States or in any country abroad outside of Venezuela, because I basically wanted to study abroad for 1 year. And I had talked to my parents, and they said, well, we'll try to make it happen, but we'll see how we can make it happen. And it actually, the plan that I had, that was to study abroad for 1 year through like a private organization, it actually didn't work out. And instead, my dad was talking to a colleague one day, and his colleague told him that there was this organization in Venezuela that would give out scholarships for teenagers ages 16 to 18 to study abroad, not for 1 year, but for 2 years at some schools that are called United World Colleges. And that day, my dad called me and they told me, hey, go on the website and check it out. And I think we're still on time for you to apply for the selection process. Check it out and see if you want to do it. And I was a bit skeptical, but I checked it out. And that's how I learned about the opportunity that single-handedly changed my life. You guys, I think you've seen, or if you have heard the episode with Wilmer Chavarria, episodes 8 and 9, we talk about what the United World Colleges are, but for sure, these are the best thing that could have happened to me, is an opportunity to study in what is now called the Kingdom of Eswatini, but used to be called the Kingdom of Swaziland, and is this tiny landlocked country in southern Africa. And it really changed my life. I got a scholarship to go to this boarding school that was an international school, and I studied the International Baccalaureate Diploma. And the IB diploma, if you've heard of it, is actually a very rigorous academic certificate that really prepares you very well to get into a university and excel at university. So when I made it to the Kingdom of Eswatini to go to UWC, I actually didn't have a good enough English. If you ask any of my friends from that time, they would tell you that I had a super strong accent and that they couldn't quite understand very well what I was saying. But it didn't matter really to me. I thought that I was making myself understood, and I would just talk. I would talk as much as I could, and I tried to make friends when I got there. And there is one particular story that I tell all the time because it really paints the picture of how unaware I was of how bad my English was. So this must have been probably a week after I arrived at the school in Eswatini, and they took us for an outdoor event. We were supposed to do hiking at a natural reserve park, and as a group, we would do a hiking activity, and then in the afternoon, we would have an opportunity to go swimming, and then have dinner, and then we will go back to school. So it was meant to be part of orientation and to make sure that we could meet the other students in the program and that we can make friends. And so I was in one of the groups and in the hiking in the morning, and for some reason my group got lost. And no, I wasn't leading. I often get lost when I do something, so never follow me for directions or ask me for directions. But in this particular circumstance, I was not leading the group. But anyway, we got lost, and we actually got lost for a really long time because once we made it back to the campgrounds, people were surprised to see us. And then we also realized that people had been back from their hikes for a couple of hours already, and we were just getting in. We were definitely the last group to go into the campgrounds. And so then it was time for dinner, and they made dinner, and I was honestly really, really exhausted. Not necessarily from the hike, but when you are learning a second language and you're fully immersed in that second language and you don't speak it very well and you don't have a dominance of that language, your brain gets very tired very, very fast. And that was the case for me. That day, I was fried. I was so exhausted that I picked up my food and I went to a quiet place in a corner, and I just sat there by myself and I started to eat my food. And so maybe a couple of minutes later, this guy comes by and he sits right next to me, and he introduces himself and he says his name is Tato, and he starts talking to me. And I started talking to him, and I think he asked the right questions, and he probably hit a chord with me because he asked me about my family and what I did back in Venezuela. And I told him my entire life story. I told him about my family. I told him about doing gymnastics. I told him about doing diving and all of these things. And we talked forever. I think it was at least more than an hour that we sat there and we talked. So again, this was only a week after I had arrived, and I wasn't quite aware that my English wasn't good. But then Tato and I actually became really good friends, and we continued to be friends even to this day. And, maybe about 6 months later, Tato and I were hanging out in the school, and I asked him, Tato, you remember that one time during orientation that you sat down and you talked to me? And he said, yeah, of course. And I asked him, well, how do you understand what I was saying? My English was so bad. And he looked at me with this very, very sweet face, and he said, well, I actually didn't understand you, but you were very happy to talk. And so I just let you. I nodded every now and then, and you just said the entire story yourself. And so, that is really what my life is like most of the time, I'm not often embarrassed by doing stuff. And really, that is what has helped me get better in any skill in life. Definitely in the school, it helped me get better at English. And that's because people would help me. Every time I made a mistake, they would correct me. And the more I practiced, the more mistakes they would find. And therefore, the more I got corrected. And then the more opportunities I had to get better. So the same thing has happened even nowadays, in my PhD. That was true, and it's still the same for my personal life. There's one thing about me, and I can't really quite point down what it is, but I don't know if it is that I'm not afraid of embarrassing myself, or that I am so oblivious that I can't fathom the possibility of being wrong, that doesn't stop me. Being wrong, or the possibility of being wrong, doesn't stop me. Maybe I don't think it's possible that I'm wrong, and so I just say whatever, but it doesn't stop me. And that really has helped me in my life to be better and to improve at every single skill that I have developed over the years. So anyway, when I was in Swaziland, or in Eswatini, I'm sorry to continue mixing these names, but for me, it's always going to be Swaziland, even though the name is Eswatini. But being there was by far the best experience of my life, not only because it allowed me to live with people from all over the world and to really experience what it is to be in a diverse environment and to be in an inclusive environment, that it literally changed my life. I made very strong friendships that I still have and I still cultivate over the years. And really also that opportunity was what opened the doors for me to continue with my education outside of Venezuela. And it's the one opportunity that catapulted me to the career that I have now. One of the things that this school did for me was that at the time when I was graduating from UWC, there was an opportunity to apply to universities in the United States, and Shelby Davis and the Davis Foundation founded the David Scholars. And what this would do is the ability for UWC students to apply to university in the United States, to certain universities. And if you got accepted based on your own merits, then you would get a scholarship, a full scholarship to study in the United States, to do your bachelor's career here. And so that's how I eventually went to the University of Florida to study or to complete my bachelor's in chemistry, like you may have heard before. And one of the really cool things that I was able to do, and one of the reasons why I chose the University of Florida to go to school, was because they had one of the strongest diving teams in the United States, and I actually got to be a diver in the UF team, and I got to compete in the NCAA Division I competitions with the UF swimming and diving team. And that whole experience was such a cool experience. It really sort of cemented the pride that I have for UF, because as an athlete, they really try to brainwash you, basically, with the athletics department. But it was such a strong, it was such a cool experience to be able to be a student athlete that I loved it when I was there. But it was also really hard. So when I was telling you back earlier in the episode about the schedule that I followed when I was in high school or even in elementary school in Venezuela, it was a very rigorous schedule. And it was even more rigorous when I started university at UF, because this time I had to wake up at 5 o'clock in the morning to go to conditioning with the swimmers, and we would do conditioning for a couple of hours, and then I would go to class between 10 a.m. and 12 p.m. And then I would run back to the swimming pool and do diving. So diving practice in the afternoon, and then probably from noon to about 2 or 3 p.m. and then run to class at 3 p.m. and then do a chemistry lab for 3 hours or 4 hours and only make it back to my dorm at about 7 p.m. So for my entire freshman year when I was at UF, it was very hectic. I had very little time to do anything that was not related to school or to diving. And I wasn't lost, but I really didn't learn much more than those two things: how to be an athlete at UF, and then how to keep my head above water while pursuing my chemistry in my calculus classes, because I decided when I was at UF that I wanted to study chemistry. So for that first year, it was pretty hectic. But the one thing that I had going for me is that when I got to UF, I got to UF on an academic scholarship, not on an athletic scholarship. And that gave me a lot of freedom. When eventually, after the first maybe 9 months training, I realized that wasn't what I wanted to do anymore, even though I was very good in the potential to go to the Olympic Games came back. There was an opportunity for me to join in the Venezuelan diving team and potentially start competing to maybe one day go to the Olympics. I decided that that's not what I wanted to do with my life. And I decided to quit diving and just continue to be a regular student at UF. So I was lost at that time. I was actually lost when I realized that I wasn't going to do diving anymore. Now I had all of this free time that I didn't know what to do with, and I didn't even know where to go to look for information. I sort of just stumbled my way around, and after I quit the diving team is when I started maybe making a little more friends with people who studied chemistry, and I started learning about people doing internships and about preparing for grad school, if that some people were doing that, and talking about the GRE and all the things that you needed to do to go into grad school. And quite frankly, this was my sophomore year and I didn't really know any of those things. Some of the friends that I had made in my chemistry classes were already doing undergraduate research, and I had zero experience, absolutely zero experience doing research. So I sort of heard about it, and I think I asked somebody to sort of explain to me what was going on. In reality, what happened, and it's something that you have heard me say before, is that I sort of stumbled my way through undergrad and I figured out what I needed to do, but I definitely did not have a support structure or a support network that would help me figure out what I needed to do to graduate and then go to grad school. But I did it. I did it out of brute force, which is one of the reasons why I found motivation to do this podcast, because I didn't want people to have to just struggle as much as I did. Even though I had all the financial support that I could need, I still struggled a little bit because I didn't know where to find that information. And so I hope that this podcast is a repository of information and ideas that people can sort of look to in order to make their lives a little easier. But like I said, I didn't give up. I found a way. I eventually convinced my undergraduate teacher in organic chemistry to let me do research in his lab. And I had one of the best mentors, maybe not because he taught me a lot about chemistry, but because he was a very good friend, my friend Xander. And he actually was the person who motivated me to go to Texas A&M afterwards for my PhD, because Xander had done his undergraduate at Texas A&M University, and then he did his PhD at UF. So as his sidekick, I decided to sort of follow a similar path. So I did apply to grad school, and I applied to grad school at Texas A&M, and I applied to grad school at UF and at North Carolina State University. And of all the schools that I applied to, I've said this before, I almost did not get accepted at UF because even though they knew me, my GRE scores were really bad. They were so bad that people knew who I was, that my advisor was in the admissions committee, and I almost didn't make it in. At the end of the day, I made it in, but I decided that the money that they gave me to support me through school in terms of my stipend and my tuition was not going to be enough. They didn't pay for my fees. And by the way, when I've said this before, when you do a PhD in chemistry and in the sciences in general, it's not the thing that you have to pay for, it's the thing that you get paid for. You don't make enough money to become rich, but you make enough money to be able to support yourself through those years. And so it's an opportunity if you're thinking about furthering your education. And I think if you're doing chemistry as a bachelor's, you definitely should think about doing a PhD because it opens up a lot more opportunities afterwards for the types of careers that you can pursue. So eventually, I got accepted to Texas A&M University and in the chemistry department to do my PhD. And one of the things that I did before going to grad school was to, again, study abroad in Austria, in the city of Vienna. And this was such a great opportunity that I had because my scholarship paid for it. Essentially, it was an exchange program so that my tuition and fees that I paid at UF through my scholarship would cover my tuition and fees in Vienna. And I found a family that is fantastic, the Michler family, and they welcomed me in their house for almost no money. They let me stay at their house and welcomed me as part of their family. So I also didn't have to spend a lot of money when I was in Vienna because I serendipitously found this great family that accepted me as their own. And so I had the best time when I was there because I had an opportunity to visit all those friends that I had made when I was in Swaziland, and I traveled to meet them in their houses, in their cities, and meet their families. And that was one of the best experiences that I've had in my life. I took trains, I ate bread all the time, and I had very little money, but I enjoyed every single one of those months that I spent in Europe visiting my friends. And it was a great experience, really, because it helped me understand what kind of life I wanted to live. The Europeans are very much focused on having a quality of life that maybe in the US, people are not so focused on. It's all about enjoying your time, spending time with your family and your friends, and trying to sort of work to live, not live to work like you do in the United States. So I always kept that experience in my mind and pretty much as a goal of what I wanted to do with my life. And when I was in Vienna, actually, it was perhaps one of the first experiences that I had not quite belonging to a place. Up until that time, I had either been in Venezuela or I had been in UWC, which is a place that was diverse by definition, and I was not supposed to sort of be part of the majority group, but I also didn't feel like I wasn't welcome and included. And then after that, I went to UF because at UF, we had a large Latino population that was very important to me to have. I wanted to be able to eat Venezuelan food and speak Spanish and dance salsa because I hadn't done it for 2 years and I really missed it. And so that was one of the reasons why I chose to go to UF. So when I went to Vienna, I loved all the people that were my friends and that welcomed me, but I could definitely see in the streets that people would look at me differently. I would be in the subway and people would stare at me. Sometimes I would be with friends in the subway and I would be talking to them and I would notice that people were looking at me. And so for me, it was like, wow, I must be very loud for these people. So I probably should tone it down a bit. Maybe I'd be a little more quiet. And so people won't stare at me. And then I would do that. I would be quiet. And then again in the subway and people would still stare at me so much that, I would pretend that I wouldn't see them. And then eventually we would make eye contact and I would be embarrassed because I made eye contact with them and I would break it. But then I realized that they were staring at me. Then I would challenge them. I would make eye contact and I would challenge them to break it, to be embarrassed, and they wouldn't. And so at that point, I realized that no matter what I did, whether I was quiet or not, people were going to stare at me no matter what, because in their minds, I didn't belong in the place that I was. And at that time, I realized that life is too short to sort of please everybody else. I decided that I was going to be myself because if I was loud, they would stare at me. If I was quiet, which is not like myself, they would also stare at me. And so, I said, screw it. I'm going to be myself and I'm going to wear my bright colors and I'm going to be happy and I'm going to be loud because that's who I am. And if you don't like it, then I think you're going to have to find another way to pass your time. But I tell you this story because somebody, when I asked about what were the types of things that you wanted to learn about myself, my story, and even the story of the podcast, somebody asked me, and it's actually my cousin, she asked me if I ever felt like I didn't belong and like I wouldn't achieve my goals and that I wouldn't make it to where I am today. And that's a feeling that I feel all the time, especially when I am applying to do something, say when I'm applying to grad school or when I am applying for a job. I am always afraid that I'm not going to be good enough, that my application is not going to be strong enough, and that that's going to reflect on who I am. But somehow, it's not easy, but somehow people have accepted me. I got accepted into grad school. I got a job after I graduated from grad school. And so at that point, even though those were spaces where I have never been before and spaces where maybe people think that a Latina woman like me doesn't belong in, I don't pay attention to that. If I made it in, maybe it's not for a good reason. Maybe it was a fluke of the matrix that allowed me to get in. But the one thing that I can control when I'm in that space is how hard I work. And again, how disciplined I am towards the goal that I have set to myself. And that's the one thing that nobody can beat me on. I can work harder than anybody else and I can be more disciplined than anybody else. And so that really is what has helped me excel in the places that I've been in. even though people think that I don't belong there, and even though I feel sometimes that I don't belong there and that I sort of don't fit in that environment, it doesn't matter. I stop thinking about what people might think of me, and I just work hard and I basically achieve the goals that I have set for myself. Because again, that's the one part of the story that I can control. I can control the passion and the work and the discipline that I put towards something, and that's definitely something that has helped me be successful in my career so far. And so after Vienna, then again, I went to grad school at Texas A&M, and I think, it wasn't easy, but like I said, I worked really hard and I finally got the groove of things. And I had maybe in my third year of grad school, I decided that I wanted to do an internship. So I applied for an internship at Halliburton, and again, I was a little lost again, and I didn't quite know how it worked to apply for an internship through the career fair or the career center. This is the time when the companies come to campus for a career fair and they select people and they do interviews right there, and they may or may not offer you an internship. And so I actually didn't even get an opportunity to get interviewed at the career center. So I was a little disappointed, but I decided that, they were still going to come to school and they were going to do an information session. So I could learn something from going to that information session, even though I didn't have an internship to prepare for. And so I went to that session and I learned a little bit about what Halliburton was and what they did. And then there was a breakout session where they would have one person that would talk about the kind of jobs that people in chemistry or in physics or even in chemical engineering could do at Halliburton. And that was a smaller group, and there was one recruiter there. And when that recruiter finished doing her presentation and we finished having a discussion and we had sort of wrapped up for the night, I approached that recruiter and I asked her if I could get a little bit of feedback on my resume, because I hadn't got an internship and I hadn't got an interview, and I really wanted an opportunity to do an internship with Halliburton, and I wanted to know how I could improve. And so she looked at my resume and she said, it looks pretty good. Maybe you can fix this and that. And, good luck. And so I thanked her for her time and I went home, a little sad that I hadn't got an opportunity to interview, but yet feeling accomplished because I had got some feedback from a recruiter and I had sort of stretched myself to do something outside of my comfort zone. And so I went to bed that day, and then in the morning when I wake up, I actually have a phone call or a missed phone call at my office in the lab, and I have an email from the recruiter saying that she had found a spot in the afternoon for me to come and interview. And wow, I was so surprised that she had made that availability for me. And of course I started scrambling because I hadn't prepared for the interview. And so I started studying with my questions and practicing the STAR method and things like that. And then eventually, long story short, I actually got an internship at Halliburton, and I did it for 3 months in the summer of 2015. But I tell you this story because I want you to understand that everybody gets rejected. And like I said in an episode with Dr. Patricia Varela, if you're not getting rejected, then you're not trying hard enough. You're not stepping out of your comfort zone enough. I think that we really have to learn to deal with rejection because it hurts every time it happens, but it hurts a little less the more often it happens. And so that's one of the things that I learned from this opportunity. One was that, even though I get rejected, it doesn't mean that is the end of the road. And two, it pays to still invest the time, even when you might think that you're not going to get anything out of it. If I had not decided to go to that info session that day, I would have not got the opportunity to talk to the recruiter. And then I would definitely have had no opportunity to intern at that company. And so if you are feeling like these are very hard times and you get rejected all the time, know that it happens, and it happens very often, and it's very normal, and you shouldn't just give up because you got rejected. Just get up, lick your wounds, and continue, because it's going to get better and you're going to achieve your goals. After that interview with Halliburton, I did my internship, and I actually got really good feedback. I liked what I was doing, and I went back to my lab to finish my dissertation. And that was the time when I was supposed to start applying for jobs. And because I was a Latina woman in chemistry, so in a STEM field, I actually had quite a bit of opportunities to sort of be a diverse recruit for these companies that were looking for talent. For me, I had three main opportunities. One of them, it's called the Dow Best Symposium, which is a symposium that Dow Chemical hosts every year for talent for students, graduate students of color or minorities that are pursuing chemistry and chemical engineering. And this was really a very good opportunity for me to go to Midland in Michigan, which is the headquarters of Dow Chemical, and they paid for all the expenses that we would incur to go to Midland for 2 days to learn about the company and to showcase our skills to the company. And so from that experience, I got a couple of interviews with the company, but again, because I was very lost and I didn't really quite know what to do during these interviews at the beginning, I didn't get a job. But it was still a very good experience. After that, I applied to another conference that is called the First Conference by P&G, and again is a conference for minorities, and this was probably one of the best recruitment conferences that I ever attended, because they really helped me understand what the recruitment process was like, and they helped me develop the skills that I needed to be successful in an interview. And so that was by far the best recruiting conference that I ever went to. Oh, and by the way, I applied the first time for the first conference and I got rejected, and then applied again the next year and I got accepted. And when I finally got to that conference, I realized that they only accepted 8 people out of, I don't know, hundreds of applications they probably got. So that goes to say again, if you get rejected the first time and you have an opportunity to try again, you should definitely try again. After that, I did one more recruitment conference for which I was actually not invited. This was for a chemical company called BASF, and they had a conference that is called the Research Forum. And in order to invite people to the Research Forum, they would send invitations to faculty members, and the faculty members would then select one of their students to be considered for a spot at the Research Forum. And my lab, I think, didn't receive that invitation, but that was a conference that I knew I wanted to try and go to. And I got that invitation from a friend that sent it to me because he got it some other way. And when I learned that the invitation asked for professors to sort of propose one of their students to be considered, I immediately emailed my faculty advisor, my graduate advisor, and I asked her if she could please postulate me for that opening. And And then she did. She had no problem with that. She sent that email to the company, and I, at the same time, prepared my application and sent it over. So I tell you this story because, like I said, this was something I knew I wanted, but the opportunity wasn't there for me to go. It didn't come to me. So that was an opportunity that I created for myself. Sometimes we think that we need to ask for permission, or we need for somebody to invite us to go to the party. But in reality, sometimes you have to find those opportunities for yourself. And if they're not there, you have to create them for yourself. So that is something that I did. And I got accepted to go to that recruitment conference. And again, it was a great experience. And it only helped me in my quest to, a few months later, try to get a job with that company. So I definitely recommend all these 3 recruitment conferences that I told you about. The first 2 are specifically targeted for minority students in STEM fields, and Latinx people are part of that minority group. And so if you are in one of the STEM fields, you should definitely check it out in your 3rd and 4th year of graduate school, when you're maybe a year or a year and a half away from graduation. So those were the main things that I did when I was in grad school, and definitely were the things that helped me the most when it came time for me to look for a job. So in December of 2016, I successfully defended my dissertation in polymer chemistry, and I became a PhD. And shortly after that, I started working in corporate America. And to tell you the truth, at that point, I had been living in the United States for at least 12 years, and I had not felt the difference in cultures, and I had not felt the fact that I was a Latina person living in the United States. I knew that I was well prepared. I had no doubt of my ability to do the job that I had got. But all of a sudden, when I started working and a couple of months into it, I realized that I was being sort of judged for the way that I was speaking. And I realized that people spoke in a code that I didn't quite understand. It was a different type of English that I didn't get taught in school. And for me, it was all very confusing because for one way or another, I'm a very direct person. And this was not going very well for me. And when I turned around to try and look for advice, I didn't see any Latinx leaders in the company. I didn't see any Latinx person at my same level in the company that I could talk to. And really, there were very, very few people. Once I opened my eyes, there were very few Latinx people working in the company at a level similar or higher than mine. And that wasn't a problem for a few months, but then I realized that really I needed that kind of support because I needed somebody who understood what was going on in that environment and who could also help me understand from my perspective as a Latino person how to navigate that environment, and I didn't have it. And so that's when I really got more interested in understanding what the problem was and understanding how we could increase the representation of Latinx professionals in all fields, because it really looked like there were not very many. And I honestly was very privileged to have been born in a country where I was part of the majority, where I was always affirmed, and where I saw people looking like me and being like me in positions of power. And so I never doubted that I was capable of doing a job like the one that I had got, and even better than that, or much more than that. But I can't understand how, if the only you see in the media or around you are Latinx people who may be portrayed as drug dealers or farmers and, maybe people who clean houses, then maybe it will be difficult for some people to aspire to be more than that. Not that there's anything wrong with being a farmer or a cleaning person, but know that there's always a possibility to be more than that. And whatever dream you have is actually possible. So that's really how this podcast started. And for many years, I had been thinking of a way that I could get a little more involved in my community, or that I could do something a little more significant to help others. And I hadn't found what that medium would be. And at some point, I realized that my husband and I, you've met my husband, I interview him in episode 6 as part of one of the team members of this podcast. And so Agustin and I realized that as two people who are professionals in their fields, we have access to a pretty large network of Latinx professionals that we can quickly call for help and that we can quickly talk to for advice. And we wanted to make that network available to more people, because the Latinx community, we haven't built that generational knowledge that maybe the white people in the United States have, or even African Americans also have in their own way. The Latinx community hasn't had the time to build that network. And so we thought that one of the things that we could contribute to the community was access to that network. And one of the nicer ways to do it was through a podcast. And so that is how Latinx Can was born, a podcast where you can hear the tips and tricks that help people turn their dreams into reality. So that's what I've been doing for the past 6 months. But to be honest with you, it was a great idea, and I was very excited about that idea and to get it working. And even though I was very passionate about it, I was scared. I was really scared of being embarrassed, of nobody listening to what I had to say and what the people that I would invite to my podcast had to say. So for a really long time, I didn't do much about it. I was a bit paralyzed by that fear. But when the pandemic hit in mid-March in the United States, and we started seeing maybe a couple of months after how it affected the Black and Latino community so much more than it affected the white community, I realized that the time was now, that I couldn't keep waiting on this project, because there are many people out there who can benefit. And if they can listen and if they can find a little bit of advice in what we are doing here, it would definitely be a positive influence in a person's life. And so that's really how I got started with this project. After almost a year of just thinking about it and not really doing anything, I had a little bit of extra time, or actually a lot of extra time, because we couldn't go anywhere during the pandemic. So I made that my pandemic project, and I watched a lot of videos about how to make a podcast and what kind of equipment I would need. And I think the most important thing that I did was to ask for support from my friends in my network. And the one person I want to thank the most right now is my friend Maria Daniela Correa. She is the person who made our logo and who made sort of the design and the color palette for this particular project. And I loved it. It really portrays the energy that I want to transfer with this podcast. And Maria Daniela was a person who said, I will do this. And I will do it because it's a project that I want to support, because it's a project from Latinx people to Latinx people, and I would like to be a part of that. So if you have any marketing needs, you definitely have to follow Int Market on Instagram. And if you have anything that you want to consult in, either in Spanish or in English, just let me know, and I can put you in touch with my friend Maria Daniela, who did an amazing job. And I really wanted to thank her for everything that she has done for us. And so apart from that, which was one of the most important things because it's the face of our podcast out in the internet, I got some help from Agustin and some help from Patty, whom you heard about in the previous episode. And really, that's how we got started. One day I just sat down, I asked for somebody to join me in this interview, and I jumped in the water. And I knew that I was going to figure out how to swim at some point. And I have been keeping my head above water ever since. So this is a project that I am very passionate about, and I hope that there are many, many more episodes coming and more seasons of the podcast coming as well. That brings me actually to some of the questions that people had about the podcast. And one of the questions or a couple of the questions were about what had I learned while doing the podcast and what I would do different. So one of the things that I have learned while doing the podcast has to do with the stories of the people that I have interviewed so far, including my own. And the one thing that I've realized is that the common denominator for all of these people is having passion for something and having a goal and then working really hard for it. All of the people that I have interviewed so far are people who are very perseverant and don't give up if they encounter any obstacles. They just, they find the obstacle and find a million different ways in which they could surpass it. And another thing that is very key is that they have not been afraid to ask for help. And so that is something that if I can share with more people, I will. Like I said before, don't let yourself be stopped by the challenges that you face. Rather, find creative ways of overcoming them and also ask for help. And if you need help, you can always send us an email at latinxcan@gmail.com and we can try and help you if you have any challenges that you need to overcome. And then one thing that I will be doing differently from now on, and specifically on the next season, because this is our last episode for this season, is before I was taking an episode, and if it was a little over an hour and 20 minutes, I would break it into two to make it a little more manageable for people to listen. But it almost seems like the second part of that episode receives less attention. So from now on, I'm going to be recording the episode with a particular guest all in one sitting. That's how I record. But when I post the episode, it will be the full episode. It will not be broken into two parts. And so hopefully that way, if you find it to be too long, you can hit pause and do something else and then come back to your episode. Or you can just set about an hour of your time. Whenever you think that you're going to have an hour of your time, then listen to Latinx Can, because that's going to be the goal, about an hour episode each time, so that we can all listen to the stories of these amazing Latinx professionals and also find the tricks that they use to overcome their challenges and to achieve their goals. With all of that, I will say goodbye to all of you. Remember, this is the last episode of this season, but all the episodes for this season are posted online. Find it wherever you listen to your podcasts. And if you have any feedback for us, please make sure to either follow us on Instagram at LatinxCan and leave us a comment, or send us an email at latinxcan@gmail.com. And I hope that you have a very safe and restful holiday season. I hope that you connect with your loved ones virtually if necessary. Wear your mask and make sure that you take care of each other. And until then, I'll see you next year with a new season of Latinx Can.